I appreciate you all taking time out of your busy schedules for this new board member series. And today we're going to talk about roles and responsibilities and governance standards. This is going to be a little more content heavy than what you've experienced so far. Know that you will get a copy, excuse me, that's not a good sign at the beginning of a webinar. Know that you're going to get a copy of the PowerPoint as part of your resource material that is forwarded to you following the webinar. So don't feel like you have to take copious notes, but by all means, if there's something that I say that really just strikes well with you, feel free to take those notes so you don't forget that particular piece of information. So for those of you that I haven't met, and that's most of you, right? Because we haven't been in person yet. My name is Debbie Stair, and I am the Assistant Director of Leadership Development at MASB. I have been on staff now for almost 7 years. But prior to that, I was a board member like you. I served over 15 years in my local board. I served several years on the ISD board in my area, as well as serving on MASB's board of directors. And one day there was an opening at MASB, and although I had already worked for the Principals Association and the Superintendents Association, I knew this was my home. And I knew that because I love board service. It really is one of the most impactful things that you will ever do. I know as I look back, I can honestly say that at times it was some of the most challenging work I've ever done. And yet it was also the most rewarding work I ever did. And so I'm really grateful that I get to give back to an association that I gained so much from throughout my entire board career, as well as paying it forward by helping new board members like you kind of get a nice solid footing as you begin your work in board service. So I want to welcome you to board service, and hopefully you'll find some nuggets today in the information that we share with you. All right, let's see if the technology all works, because sometimes you practice and it does, and sometimes you get in the space and things change. There we go. All right. So, you really are now part of a team in your district that is very important to your students and your communities. And it's, the very reason that school boards were created was to serve as a liaison between the professional educators and the community they serve. And that's to oversee the district. Imagine that the first school board committee was appointed way back in 1721, and that by the early 1800s, legislation was in place creating what we now know as school boards. One of the many benefits to creating a team to oversee local school districts is really cited on the slide. It's the various perspectives and the experiences that board members bring to the table. And you're going to see, starting here, if you haven't heard it yet, that MASB is often going to refer to your governance team. And when we say that, I thought it would be great to have this conversation up front. We don't mean just the 7 elected or appointed officials as school board members. We believe that this governance team is a team of 8, and that includes your superintendent. And so again, you're going to hear that phrase often in courses and events. And so it helps if you kind of put that in the back of your mind. Oh, governance team, team of 8. It's important that we look at that whole group together. And even though we understand that the superintendent and the board members have very definite and distinct roles and responsibilities, and those complement each other. So we're going to take a closer look at that concept of roles and responsibilities. Okay. So the reason, as I said, school boards were created to be that liaison. And I find as I work with boards around the state, because roles and responsibilities really is one of our most requested workshops, especially after an election cycle. Um, Boards and superintendent teams want to make sure they get off to a good start and form this new cohesive team. And so one of the things I have found in doing those workshops is that roles and responsibilities can really be one of the hardest concepts for board members to grasp. And I include myself in that. I had been actively involved in my school district before I ran for the school board. I had attended board meetings for a number of years and felt like I had a good handle on what was going to happen and what my responsibilities were, only to learn that there was a lot to learn as I sat at that board table. Interestingly enough, we run on platforms. We talk about all the things we want to fix, only to get elected and then realize, oh, this is a role of oversight. This is a role of governance. And what makes it hard for so many is that in our personal lives, whether we work outside the home or for now at home, right? Or your work is managing the home, we're really all some sort of project managers and problem solvers, right? We're used to rolling up our sleeves and getting the work done, but that's not what governance is or oversight. That's what management and operations is. And so we're going to dig into some of the best practices of what those roles and responsibilities look like. So imagine that, as I mentioned, school boards have been around in some form since the 1700s, but there wasn't any real good, meaty, comprehensive research about the impact that they could actually have on student achievement until the early 2000s. Volumes of research about superintendents, principals, and especially teachers, right? Because they're dealing directly and somewhat indirectly with students. And so lots about their impact on student achievement, but nothing about boards. And so luckily for us, our colleagues in Iowa took on the task. And so the Iowa Association of School Boards partnered with their Superintendents Association and their State Department of Education, as well as Iowa University, to study this topic. And so from that research, the National School Boards Association, or NSBA, as you'll hear them referred to as you get more involved in your board work, actually took that work and distilled it down. And they said, if boards spent their time mastering these 5 areas, they will actually have the greatest potential of positive impact on student achievement. So let's take a look at those 5 areas. So effective school boards establish clear visions with high expectations for quality teaching and learning. They ensure that high academic standards, transparency, and accountability towards those standards are in place at all levels. It really is through policy, the third one, that school boards establish a set of guidelines that actually guide the work of the staff and transform that vision into a reality. In the community leadership area, school boards share their concerns and actions with the public, right, through established mechanisms for community engagement, as well as taking on public education advocacy. And in that last area, you see relationships. And, I want to say last, but certainly not least here, highly effective boards recognize the importance of a healthy relationship with their superintendent, as well as each other. And they regularly take steps to improve those relationships. This one is accomplished in part by understanding and carrying out those distinctly different roles and responsibilities, among other things. So let's take a look at what that actual work looks like. So now that we sort of see that higher level perspective, let's take a look at this chart. And I'm going to confess up front, I stole this chart. This actually comes from our CBA 101 course. And so some of you may have already taken that course. I hope you have. If you haven't, there's still lots of opportunities to get signed up. But this chart actually, I think, breaks it down really nicely to to look at the various roles in the district and where a board falls and what their work looks like in comparison to others. So if we look at the first column, which is the strategic work of school boards, right, we see that we're really the big picture. I mentioned oversight, and I want you to think of a sort of 50,000 foot view, if you will. So imagine yourself in a hot air balloon, right? Up high, looking down. You're taking a look at the entire organization of the school district. Some of you will have bigger organizations than others, but again, your focus is the entire district. You do see how parts relate to the whole, but your main focus is really in making sure that you're touching all those areas and making sure that they complement each other as well. Focusing on representing the community's needs and interests. I mentioned that. That's why boards were formed in the first place. You look out long term, usually 3 to 5 years. That's part of that visioning that boards are entrusted with, is making sure that we know where we're headed as a district, often done through strategic planning. But it's that long-term look. Where are we today and where are we headed? You provide overall structure through the district goals and through the budget that you set that supports achieving those goals. And again, you're setting those clear targets for improvement. Now, when you take a look at the second column, it gets slightly closer to the ground, right? So now let's sort of think, maybe a helicopter, right? You're just kind of coasting across the district, more like a 10,000 foot view. And although your administrator, your superintendent, and this does include your building principals and any central office administrators you might have, they're still overseeing, but again, at a closer level. And so now they're looking at a more granular level. They're looking at individual schools and individual departments. And they're actually coordinating all of those components that come together to run the greater organization. They focus on working with constituent groups, right? Because they're still in sort of that middle area. So not, on an individual basis so much, but more in groups. Now, their look ahead is a little bit closer, right? So although they have hopefully a strategic plan or those goals in place to guide their work, and those are long-term, they're looking a little bit closer, more like 1 to 3 years ahead is their planning structure. And they provide structure at, not only the district level, but also individual building or department levels. And they actually create and deploy the plans that are going to lead to the improvement in the district. So whereas the board sets targets, your superintendent and their team is actually doing the work of putting those plans in place and making sure they're carried out. We don't often talk about the third column, but I do think it is really helpful for you to see those differences. So I want to spend just a minute there. They're much closer to the ground level. And although this column says teachers, I would say that really this is any of the folks who are in your district working directly with students, right? So it could be food service, transportation, custodial, any of your support services. They are really directly impacting children in one way or another. They might oversee a classroom, maybe a department, right? Or could be their own bus or a specific area of the building, but it's much closer to the ground now, and the level of detail increases dramatically. Again, their focus is primarily on the students directly. Their look forward is much closer now. So now we're talking about days, weeks, months, maybe a year, right? And a good example of this would be a lesson plan for a teacher, where they're planning out their year and then continuing to break it down into shorter periods of time. And the reason for that is that they can make refinements and adjustments to that work as they see fit based on their experience with the students as they move through that time period. And their level of detail and structure is really at that ground level, right? In the classroom or their specific area that they might work in. So hopefully that helps to give you a little bit of a sense of the differences. Now, I am going to tell you that I have some slides in the show that I'm going to show you a couple, but know that there are, I think there's 9 of them, and they're various areas and responsibilities that you're going to find yourself dealing with. And so, as I said, you'll get this PowerPoint. So you're going to have time to really take a look at these in depth, but we won't have that much time today. So I'm going to cover just a couple. But when you do get to take a look at these and some of the other resources that you're going to receive, I want you to take a look at the types of verbs, right, that are used between the role of the superintendent and the board. So if we look at vision and values, so in the superintendent's role, it talks about supporting and assisting the board in the process of developing that mission. It goes on to talk about advising the board and implementing, right? When you look at the board's role, the verbs change. Here it talks about the board adopts and communicates that vision. Nowhere here does it talk about implementation, right? Again, implementation would be something for your staff and your superintendent to take care of. So let's flip to the next one and just give you another example of that. So here in goal setting, right? Again, we see that assists and advises. You know, as we move over to the board's role, then we're talking about ensuring that the vision is translated. And that's usually done by monitoring the progress towards those goals, right? So again, very different verbs. And I think that will really help you get a clear understanding of the differences between the board's work and the superintendent's work. Now, the next slide, actually, I put together because as you go through your experience with board service and with MASB, you're going to come into contact with different instructors and consultants who host, you know, many of our classes and workshops, and you're going to hear different terms that all relate back to this very important topic of roles and responsibilities. So I'm going to flip through these and I'm going to get to this one. And this is just sort of a flavor, if you will, of the kinds of things that you might hear referred to when we're talking about roles and responsibilities. So in the upper left-hand corner, you see what versus how. Many boards find that a useful phrase to talk about, well, boards are the what and staff is the how. And that helps some folks, but we all process information differently, right? So sometimes you'll hear someone say, stay in your lane. Those lanes being those various roles and responsibilities, right? And making sure that we're not crossing over that center white line and that we're staying in the area that we need to be because we're responsible for that area. We aren't responsible for the other area. In the center, you see what one of our instructors always refers to as eyes in, hands out. So the role of oversight is looking in on progress and processes, but never so far into it that their hands are actually in it and the board is doing the work, if that makes sense. In the lower left-hand corner is a picture of not getting in the weeds, right? And so you might hear that when boards start straying into the work of management and operations, that's called getting into the weeds, or some might actually refer to it as micromanaging. And so we want to make sure that we avoid that. The last one is something new. And I heard it from one of my colleagues in another state as we were having a conversation the other day. And so I wanted to just toss it in here. I think we're all familiar with the joke. How many fill in the blank does it take to change a light bulb? And so if we fill in that blank with board members and ask, how many board members does it take to change a light bulb? Hopefully your answer was 0. And that's because it's the board's role to say there will be light. And I really like that, right? I mean, at the most basic level, a board saying there will be light is a great example of what oversight is all about. So I hope that you find maybe one of those things will be something that helps you as you think about your role as a board member. And you'll sort of be on the lookout maybe for those common phrases when you are in those courses or those workshops with our instructional staff. All right. So MASB also took that research from the Iowa Lighthouse study, and we use that as the basis for developing our board self-assessment process. And so it is a free service to our member boards, and we encourage boards to annually assess their performance, right? Everyone else in the district is assessed or evaluated. And so the board is really the only one who isn't evaluated on their performance. Now, some people would say, yes, we're evaluated, and that's at the time of election, right? But that's a long time away, right? So if we're new to the board, your terms are probably either 4 or 6 years. And so your evaluation is not going to come around again for another 4 to 6 years, right? And your colleagues staggered to different timeframes. So a board self-assessment is really a great way for the board to say, you know what, everyone else is being evaluated, and we're going to take the step to evaluate our own effectiveness as a board. And we're going to do that on an annual basis, just like everybody else. And we're going to take the assessment individually, but we're going to debrief that assessment as a team, because that's where the real value comes in seeing the individual answers. And I've just put one slide from that report up so that you can kind of get a sense. We're all pretty familiar with the green, yellow, red concept. This particular board has a lot of green, and that's great. But they also have some areas that clearly need some improvement that they've identified. And so having that good, rich discussion with that governance team, again, the board and superintendent together, to make a plan to improve their performance is really what it's all about, right? It's that continuous improvement model that we want to reflect not only to our staff, but to our communities, that we intend to be the best board we can be. And part of that is reflected in this work that we're going to do in this board self-assessment. Again, it's based on that Iowa Lighthouse research. It's all about the things that boards are responsible for. So I'm going to shift just a little bit. We're just a little over halfway through our time together. And I'm going to shift now from what roles and responsibilities are to more like how we actually work together to carry them out. How do we as individuals bring our best selves to the board table? And how do we as a board together work at the highest levels to serve our students and our communities? So in 2017, MASB launched the Board of Education Governance Standards. They were developed by board members for board members. And we think that's important because this really is, that sort of grassroots level work. And we wanted those perceptions and experiences reflected in the outcome of this. They came together from around the state and worked really hard to build guiding principles and standards. And they're really to be reflective of that research-based best practices that were identified in that study that I've mentioned a couple of times. They're meant to provide a shared framework for effective school board governance. And they're really intended to help boards raise that bar, high levels, right, for their own behaviors and effectiveness, and to live up to those expectations as elected officials. So let's take a little bit of a look at what that looks like. So as we developed them, it really was our hope that in these standards, it would help to provide clarity, not only from board member to board member, but superintendent to board, from public to board. This is to help your public understand the role. I think that's another lesson that new board members have to learn relatively quickly, is helping educate their public on what their role really is. And it's even meant to inform those who are thinking about running for a board or applying for a vacancy. And so we encourage districts to share these governance standards far and wide with folks. We also hope that it helps boards set that bar at high levels, right? So that we're all understanding of the commitment of serving Michigan students and where that standard really should be. That they create a mechanism for leadership that informs everyone about what we value and what informs our service. And then the final one is really all about allowing each of us and our fellow members to approach our work, not only with intention, because I would say all of us have good intentions, but also reflection, so that we can constantly assess and improve our performance. And without that reflection, often that's a missing piece of determining how we're going to work towards improvement as we move forward.
Hey, Debbie, I just have a quick note. It seems like we're still on the board self-assessment slide.
I just noticed that. I am so sorry. So here's those benefits. I'm sorry about that. It's what happens when you work with two screens. I apologize for that. So there's those 4 items: providing clarity, establishing expectations, that mechanism for leadership, and that framework for improvement. Okay. So as we were actually developing them, we really wanted to make sure that we were intentionally concise in our language. We wanted it to be very plain language. I mentioned that. Board members come from all walks of life with varying levels of education. And so we didn't want that to be a barrier for anyone. And we really felt it was important to also provide a common definition of terms, right? So that when we talked about principles or vision, we all were talking from the same place. And so as you look at the document, and again, you're going to get that as a resource after the webinar, and that's also on our website. And knowing Greg, he'll throw that link up there if he hasn't done it already. You'll see that it's actually broken down into various parts, right? And it's detailed here on the screen. So in addition to the principles and standards, like I said, we thought that it was important to have that glossary. And so sometimes I almost think it helps if you read the introduction, flip to the glossary, and then go back and read the actual guiding principles and standards. But know that it's there for you, so that, again, we're all talking the same language as we move through the work of this, the governance standards. So the standards, as I said, it's broken apart into the various areas. And so what I want to do now is spend just a bit of time talking about first the principles for the whole board. So notice that it says Board of Education versus individual board member. So the principles that we felt that were guiding this work of the whole board needed to include accountability, commitment to learning, inclusivity, stewardship, transparency, and that they were vision driven. So if we take a look now at the standards that are attached to those principles, the first one, the Board of Education, in cooperation with the superintendent and stakeholders, establishes and commits to a vision for the school district that emphasizes high expectations for achievement of all students in quality instructions. So you can see, if you think back to some of that work in the roles and responsibilities work through NSBA, you can see how all these pieces fit together and overlap to really sort of reinforce those consistent concepts throughout. And know that as you look through this document, there's going to be a standard like this, and then there's going to be questions underneath it. Again, those questions are intended to provide you and your colleagues at the board table an opportunity for some really rich discussion around what does this look like in our district? Are we indeed doing this? And if we are, at what level? And what are some of the other things that should be considered as we move through this work in this particular area? The second standard, the Board of Education governs in a manner that is dignified and worthy of trust. I think now more than ever, this one is so important to people. We're all living in an uncertain time, a time of angst for many people, and our communities are hungry for a governance team that represents their interests and does it in a manner that is dignified and worthy of their trust. We see dysfunction at various levels, and so if you can be that one governance team that really can reflect a group that wants to work hard and work together and is willing to do what it takes to do the right thing, I think your communities really are searching for that. And so it's a great place for us to be the ones that can show them that, yes, indeed, that can be still managed today. The third standard is the Board of Education is accountable to the school district community. And, accountability has been a buzzword for many years. But, again, I'd like you to really dig into the language in the document when you get a chance to look at it, because it's more than a catchphrase. It's all about making sure that systems are in place to do the good work of the district and serving those students and community. The fourth and final one for the whole board is that the Board of Education holds the superintendent accountable for creating the outcomes identified in the school district plan. And if you haven't learned already, you'll be responsible for evaluating your superintendent also on an annual basis. And that's because legislation was passed that stated districts must do that. And so that's your opportunity to really spend some time across the months. It's not a one-time event. It is a process that is a 12-month process of making sure those goals are in place, and then making sure that there are checkpoints throughout the year. And then at the end of that 12-month cycle, evaluating the superintendent on those items that are in the instrument you select, as well as the academic performance portion and the progress towards district-wide goals. Again, it's not so much about the form that you fill out as it is the rich discussion that happens around that process. And so if you haven't looked into getting the training for your superintendent evaluation instrument, that's something that all new board members want to get taken care of before they reach the point where that evaluation is imminent. Okay, so now let's take a look. We're going to switch gears, and we're going to take a look at what the individual board members' principles are. And so, now we're talking about, so we've talked about the board and what the board as a whole that team should look like. Now we're going to talk about the individual, right? We only can control our own individual actions. And so we felt that it was important in this process that we separate those things. And so when it comes to the principles of the individual board member, the ones that rose to the top with this group were advocacy, civility, courage, empathy, inquiry, integrity, regard for authority of the board, and selflessness. And so I want to give you a minute just to sort of think about those. And that regard for authority of the board is really important. Remember that as an individual, you hold no authority, right? As a school board member, your real authority and power lies in the votes that you take at the board table with your colleagues. So let's now take a look at the individual standards. And so the first one is the individual school board member is motivated by and focuses on what is in the best interest of all students. Note that it doesn't say groups of students or specific groups. It says all students. And sometimes that's hard to do as a board member, making sure that you're looking at all the needs of all of your students, but highly important as you make those considerations and decisions. The second one, the individual school board member believes in the importance of and actively engages in lifelong learning. And for those of you that are on here today, you've already taken that step, and we certainly hope that you will continue to do that. That learning comes in a couple of different options, right? So today it's about an individual learning opportunity that you're engaging in, and we have many of those. And you'll have other opportunities for that through other groups as well. And then there's also the learning that you'll do as a governance team. And we feel that's really important too, to share in that learning together, hearing the same things and having the opportunity to interact and work on building your team. And so we certainly encourage those kinds of learning activities to take place within your district. The third one is the individual school board member understands and respects both the authority and responsibilities of the Board of Education. And so we talked about responsibilities, and I've already mentioned that authority of the vote at the table and taking it, very seriously, and respecting the colleagues that you work with in that vein. And then last but not least, the fourth one, the individual school board member approaches school governance work with a spirit of inquiry. And I think especially for new board members, this one's pretty important because, like I said, we all come to this board work having campaigned and thinking that we have a lot of answers for things that we've seen in the district. And I think it's important to really remind us all, and I had to do it myself. When I first came to the board table, was to really open up my mind and allow all that other information to come in about various topics before I made decisions at the board table, and really listening to learn, right? That spirit of inquiry really is going to serve the individual board member well as you maneuver through very difficult decisions over time. Some are going to be easier made than others, and so the more you can keep that open mind and that willingness to learn and ask questions and get all the information before making decisions over time is going to serve you really well. So with that, I think I have shared a lot of content at this point. Again, you're going to get that document, and I hope that you will find it useful and meaningful in your ongoing work as board members. And before I turn it over to Greg for some announcements, I just want to say that I hope you'll actually look at today's webinar as one piece in your learning puzzle. Oh, and I didn't change the slide. There it is. That you'll look at it as one piece in your learning puzzle, and that you'll actually commit to continue adding those puzzle pieces throughout your board service. So with that, Greg, you have some announcements, and then we're going to open it up to those questions that I'm sure Greg has been following, and that you can start typing in now if you haven't done so yet. And I'm going to stop sharing, right, Greg?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Debbie. So yes, as she just mentioned, for those that don't know me, my name is Gregor Kisky. I am MASB's Assistant Director of Marketing. I work within our Communications, PR, and Marketing department. So before we head into Q&A, so as you're thinking up those burning questions that you'd love Debbie to answer while you have her in the live room, just a few things as it relates to new board members. First, if you didn't see this week's email announcing the certificate of completion for new board members, I just wanted to touch on that. So between January and November, anyone who attends at least 8 of these new board member series webinars live, and the key there is live, you will receive a certificate of completion of this year's new board member series webinars. We're working up some exciting ways to recognize that group, including a webinar in December. You can think a virtual graduation of sorts. So a way to celebrate all of your hard work and dedication in this first year of service. And as Debbie mentioned, we hope that you continue that board development and training in years beyond. The next thing I wanted to touch base on is a new board member happy hour. So we want to provide ways in the virtual space for you all to connect and network with other new board members around the state outside of just the chat. And so the first one we'll be coordinating in this month around Winter Institute will take place on Friday, February 19th from 4:30 to 5:30 Eastern. And so that should have also been included in the email you received this week. Once I have a moment, I will try and drop that link in the chat to register, and you'll also receive it in follow-up with today's recording and other resources. And the final thing that I want to announce and forecast, another way is sharing kind of what you're going through along this journey. So we're very excited that in the next month or two, we'll be opening up an online community for new board members, specifically for you to connect in addition in between these webinars and happy hours. So all of those things will be coming and we're very excited for that. And so I think if Debbie's okay with it, I can shift into the Q&A session. So I have kind of, I've been looking at questions coming in and I will start to throw them your way, Debbie, unless you've seen one that you want to start with.
Okay, no, I was trying to scroll back through and oh, now and I haven't really seen too many, so maybe you can toss out some.
Absolutely. So Morgan has asked, what is the best way for oversight, i.e. committees, letting the superintendent dictate what is important to the board, directors briefing the district on a monthly basis, etc.? Where is the line between asking what is going on and getting in the weeds?
Yeah, so, that's a great question. And there was one of our board members here from TCAP's Traverse City Area Public Schools that I just spent some time with this week talking about committee structure and what is the best structure for a governance team to use in that more detailed level work. And what I'm going to say is there's not one right way. What you'll find as you move through board service is that it's more an art than it is a science. And it's somewhat district specific. So we certainly encourage that you have those conversations together as a group, again, with your superintendent to determine what are our expectations as a board around progress towards goals or in individual topic areas like facilities or finance. And then, trying out what you think is the right mix at the right time for this particular group. And then allowing yourself to use that structure for some time, and then, take a step back and evaluate, did what we put in place work for us? And if it did, great, we continue to work that way. And if it didn't, well, it doesn't need to be totally revamped or simply tweaked to better serve our needs. And so, I think, again, it's that rich discussion among the governance team that will help you make those decisions.
Wonderful answer. So Paula asks, how do I get trained on superintendent evaluation?
There's several different methods. So first, Paula, you're going to want to find out who is the maker of your superintendent evaluation instrument, because that will determine how you go about getting trained. So for instance, if your board is using MASB's tool, we offer ongoing training in a couple of different ways. If you're the only one who's new on your board, then by all means, we suggest that you sign up for one of our live webinars. We host those about once a month in the evenings to make it convenient for board members. It's about a 3-hour training. And that way you'll get your credit that says that, yes, indeed, I've been trained on the tool. We also suggest that if there's been a considerable turnover in your governance team, and by considerable, I mean 3 or more members, and that might be inclusive of the superintendent if you've hired a new superintendent, then what we actually suggest is that the team do a whole team training again together. Because new members can really benefit from that experience that the other board members and potentially superintendent have had in using the tool. You can talk about the nuances specific to your district, because every district does use it a little bit differently when we're talking about the evidence they're looking for and the 12-month process that they're using. So 2 options from us: ongoing individual or that group training. And then again, if you're using a different instrument, you'll need to check with the maker of that instrument.
Wonderful. Thank you, Debbie. Nadia asks, will you keep track of people who meet the new board member certification requirement, or is there a way we need to keep track of webinars? So I'll actually take this one. So this is referring to if you attend 8 of the 11 new board member series webinars, do you need to keep track of that? And the answer is no. We are able to track that on our end, and we will be reaching out to those who meet the criteria and paying attention and logging to those that log in live. So we appreciate that question, and we definitely didn't want to add any more burden for you. So we are taking care of that. Great question. So Angela asked, when you talked about the superintendent's role was to advise regarding establishing goals, does the board simply have a responsibility to implement what they advise us to adopt?
Like most things, you're going to, from me, my answer is going to be that it should be an inclusive process, right? So in the absence of a strategic plan, and I'll talk about a strategic plan in a minute, but in the absence of one, most often what happens is a superintendent might come to the board with a draft set of goals, and then have some really good conversation around, are those the right ones? Is there something else that the board as a whole feels might better serve as a goal for that particular year? And then coming to agreement on it. So it's not something that one or the other should decide without that good conversation. Again, it's that work that you do together that gets you to some really great outcomes. As far as strategic plans, if you have one of those in your district where you've already identified what your vision and your mission and your goals are, then that really is the basis for that work that you continue to do each year. Strategic plans usually last somewhere between 3 and 5 years, and you're going to continue looking at that progress towards those goals during that time. You might have something very specific that only the superintendent, in the board's opinion, can work on. And so that might be just kind of an added goal. But really what you want them to do is focus on those goals that have been identified as district goals. And that's, again, strategic planning is a highly inclusive process, at least ours is, when we work with districts. We bring in a lot of different stakeholder groups, both internally and externally, to help develop that plan so that you have a large number of owners who believe in moving that plan forward and who want to see it be successful. So again, never something that the board does alone or the superintendent does alone.
Wonderful. So Kwame asks, I like to be intentional about increasing regular community discussion and engagement as a guide to my own decision making. Can you talk about some hints and caveats to keep in mind?
Community engagement is always one that I think is a little tricky for new board members, right? You've been out talking to them on a one-on-one basis during your campaign, and now you find yourself part of a board who should, with their superintendent, put structures and mechanisms in place where you have opportunities to get feedback from your community. So I mentioned strategic planning, right? There's input sessions and participants who help to make that happen. Many districts use some sort of survey opportunities. Others do some town halls. But what I really want you to focus in on is the fact that I didn't say individuals did those things, right? What I talked about was a governance team putting in place mechanisms for that to happen. It's really important for that governance team to come to agreement on things like that, so that, again, that superintendent and that staff, has a good sense of what the direction of the board as a whole is, and the ways we should go about doing that outreach and that listening.
Absolutely. And Lynn has a kind of related question, Debbie. She is asking about effective ways for community input. And does that change at all for ISD board members in your mind?
Well, having served on an ISD board, yeah, it's definitely different, right? Because you don't have the same connection necessarily to those you serve. They're not living in your community per se. You're not running into them at the grocery store. And who you're serving now really are the districts of which make up your ISD. So again, I think it's all about having that good conversation about what are our mechanisms. The players might be different, but the determination of how you're going to do that reach out and that listening is still really conducted in the same way, right? I mean, coming to the decision as a group. But again, those mechanisms might look different.
Awesome, thank you. A couple of follow-ups around superintendent evaluation. So Carol asked, when does superintendent evaluation take place?
Well, it's different for different boards. MASB's recommendation is that you start the 12-month process with goal setting in January. And then you have regular check-ins, typically quarterly. The first one being rather informal at that 6-month period. So around June, July, you would have something a little bit more formal where you might get, a more detailed update. Then you'd go back to that informal process around September, and then November, December is when you would actually do the evaluation. Now, we recognize that that might be our recommendation, but it's not always the choice that districts make. Long ago, most districts used a spring evaluation timeframe just because of contracts and things like that. So some of those districts have decided to stick with that timeframe for their evaluation cycle. Probably the most important things to think about are, one, when we did the January to December cycle, we did it in part because new board members take office in January. And so those who set the goals are going to be the same individuals who then evaluate the goals at the end of December. Now, we realize that, there might be a member who needs to step away and someone's appointed. And so they won't always be the exact same 7, but for the most part, they would be. And then the other one being, whatever cycle you choose, really try to stick with that, right? So that your superintendent has that full 12-month period to make progress on those goals that you've agreed to. You don't want to be moving your target date, from year to year unless absolutely necessary, especially in the event that usually happens is when a superintendent changes or something like that. But for the most part, you should be relatively consistent in whatever that time period is that the district has selected.
Wonderful. And Kayla asked, so you mentioned, Debbie, evaluating the evaluation structure. She asked, is it better to familiarize the board and superintendent in evaluation expectations, or should you change it after 6 years or so? And she adds a follow-up, even if board members have new members this year.
So I'm trying to read it. Evaluating the structure, evaluating expectations, change it. I'm not so sure that there's ever necessarily an arbitrary time to change an evaluation cycle or process or instrument. What I always suggest, for many topics, including this one, is that the board and superintendent come together and have a discussion that is inclusive of, is what we're using working for us, right? So that might be time frame, it might be process, and it might be instrument in this case. If it's working for us, then we probably ought to keep doing what we're doing. If it's not working for us for some reason, then it's time to have a discussion about why that is the case, and then look for options that address those things that are not working for us. And if you're thinking of changing your instrument, by all means, I would suggest that you look at the ones that are available to you. And again, have the conversation, with the 8 of you and say, which one best suits this team? And then make your decision based on that. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Debbie. And so as we wrap up, I think we're about to hit one and some folks are falling off. So this will be captured in the recording, but can you summarize kind of some new opportunities that new board members should take advantage of? You mentioned CBA 101. Can you talk about that and just Winter Institute briefly?
Absolutely. I would say, take every opportunity available to you. Find out what your board policies and procedures are around the support of your learning. And this year is a great year for all new board members who were elected in November, because we are offering our CBA 101 fundamentals class complimentary. And in addition to that, you get the National School Boards Association Becoming a Better Board Member book. And I have to tell you, I still have my dog-eared copy of my original book. I turned to that book for so many things over my 15 years. It's a great value for you to use as a resource. So that's the first one. At our Winter Institute, we're going to have a whole host of CBA classes. And I would encourage you to really think about, taking that 101 first, if the timing is right, and then looking at those other 100 level classes that really dig into topics deeper. So maybe you feel like you have a shortage in the area in your knowledge base around finance, then you might want to pick that class. For someone else, it might be curriculum or legislation. And working your way through those 100 level classes and getting your basic certification. And then from there, after you've gotten that good solid footing, then sort of exploring out past that and looking at some of our other classes that might just be of interest to you based on their topic. But by all means, take advantage of the learning opportunities that are offered. And again, go back to your districts and talk about as well those ones that might be group related, where your whole team would be together in a learning experience.
Wonderful.
Does that get at what you wanted, Greg?
It was perfect. And so I think that leaves our attendees with some homework. So that's always fun for us to kind of leave them with work to do after this until our next March New Board Member Series webinar. So we appreciate everyone joining us live, or if you're watching the recording. Again, this will be sent out in the next week with additional resources. And we thank you for taking the time for us to help you be most effective in your role. So with that,
We
have a
hope,
great afternoon, everyone. Any parting words, Debbie?
yeah, we hope to see you at future events, for now virtually, but at some point in person. I look forward to meeting each and every one of you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.